If you really want to understand intimacy on a deeper psychological level, you have to start where most people completely overlook, and that is emotional safety, because attraction, real attraction, doesn't begin with words, techniques, or clever questions. It begins in the nervous system. It begins in the unconscious calculation every human being is constantly making in social interaction. Am I safe with this person, or do I need to protect myself? Now, most people misunderstand what safety means in this context. They think it's just about physical safety or being polite, but emotional safety is far more subtle and far more powerful. It is the feeling that you will not be judged, rushed, pressured, or emotionally cornered. It is the sense that your thoughts and feelings are allowed to exist without being corrected, manipulated, or taken advantage of. When a woman feels emotionally unsafe, even slightly, her mind shifts away from openness and into protection. She becomes cautious. She becomes analytical. She starts filtering her words. And the moment that happens, intimacy doesn't grow, it collapses, not because she is uninterested, but because her system is prioritizing self-protection over connection. And here's the deeper truth most people miss. Emotional safety is not something you announce. It is something you transmit. It is communicated through your tone, your patience, your reactions, and your ability to stay grounded when the conversation becomes personal. If you become reactive, if you rush for validation, if you push for answers too quickly, you unintentionally signal pressure, and pressure is the fastest way to shut down openness. But when you remain calm, steady, and genuinely present, something very powerful happens. The other person's nervous system begins to mirror yours. They begin to relax without even realizing why. This is not persuasion, it is regulation. You are not forcing openness, you are creating the conditions where openness feels natural. Think about it like this. Intimacy is not built through extraction of information. It is built through invitation. And an invitation only works when the other person feels free to decline it without consequence. That is the paradox. The more you need a response, the less likely you are to receive honesty. The less you need it, the more freely it flows. So when you are engaging with someone you are trying to connect with, your primary focus should not be, what should I ask next? But rather, how do I make this moment feel completely safe for them to be themselves? That means slowing down your internal urgency. It means listening not just to respond, but to understand. It means allowing silence to exist without rushing to fill it. Silence, in fact, is one of the strongest indicators of emotional safety when it is comfortable rather than forced. Because in those quiet moments, the other person is not performing. They are processing. They are deciding, subconsciously, whether they can go deeper with you. And if they feel no pressure from you, they begin to trust you without needing to explain why. There is also something even more profound here. Emotional safety is what allows authenticity to emerge. Without safety, people present versions of themselves. With safety, they reveal themselves, and intimacy only exists in revelation. So if you want deeper connection, stop thinking in terms of strategy and start thinking in terms of atmosphere. Are you creating tension or calm? Are you speeding the interaction or grounding it? Are you trying to get something, or are you allowing something to unfold? Because the irony is this: the moment someone feels they are not being pursued emotionally, they often begin to move closer on their own. Not because they are being influenced, but because they finally feel free, and freedom is the foundation of real attraction. If you understand this at a deep level, you stop chasing connection and start becoming the space where connection naturally happens. And that changes everything, not just in relationships, but in how people experience you as a presence in their life, because in the end, emotional safety is not a technique. It is a state of being. And the quality of your relationships will never rise above the quality of safety you are able to create in another human being. And once you truly internalize that, you realize something simple but life-changing. People don't open up because you ask the right questions. They open up because they feel safe enough to tell the truth. And that is where real intimacy begins. Once you understand emotional safety, the next layer of intimacy becomes much clearer. And that is how you communicate through questions. Because most people don't realize this, but questions are not just tools for gathering information. Questions are signals. Every question you ask is communicating something about your intention, your awareness, and your emotional intelligence. It reveals whether you are trying to connect or whether you are trying to extract. And there is a massive difference between the two. When someone feels like they are being interviewed, they close up. When someone feels like they are being explored with curiosity and respect, they open up. That shift is subtle, but it determines everything about the depth of the interaction. Open-ended questions are powerful not because they are techniques, But because they honor complexity, a closed question forces a person into a box. Yes or no, right or wrong, short or finished. But a human being is not a box. A human being is a story in motion. And when you ask a question that allows space, you are essentially saying, I'm interested in your world, not just your answer. Think about the psychological impact of that. Most people are rarely asked questions that invite depth. They are asked questions that demand efficiency. What do you do? Where are you from? Do you like this? Those are surface-level prompts that keep interactions safe but shallow. But when you shift into open-ended curiosity, something changes in the nervous system of the other person. They begin to expand instead of contract. They begin to think instead of react. And most importantly, they begin to feel seen, not for what they present, but for what they actually experience internally. And here's where emotional intelligence becomes critical. A good question is not just open-ended. It is respectful of timing. Because depth without timing feels invasive. The goal is not to push someone into vulnerability. The goal is to create a pathway where vulnerability feels natural. For example, instead of asking something that corners a person into an immediate emotional disclosure, you invite reflection. You give them space to interpret themselves. Something like, what kind of conversations make you feel most understood? Or when do you feel most like yourself around someone? These kinds of questions don't demand performance. They invite reflection. And reflection is where authenticity begins to surface. Now, here is something deeper most people miss. The power of a question is not in the question itself. It is in your ability to hold silence after you ask it. Because the moment you ask a meaningful question, you create an internal search process in the other person. And if you rush to fill that space, you interrupt their process. But if you stay present, grounded, and calm, you give them permission to go inward. That silence is not emptiness. Silence is processing. That silence is where honesty is being formed. And this is where many people unintentionally sabotage connection. They ask a question, but they are not patient enough to receive the real answer. So they either interrupt, redirect, or over-explain. And in doing so, they replace depth with speed. But intimacy does not operate at the speed of anxiety. It operates at the speed of trust. So the real skill is not just learning how to ask better questions. It is learning how to slow yourself down enough to let the question do its work. Because when someone feels that you are genuinely interested in their answer, not just waiting for your turn to speak, they begin to trust your presence. And trust, once again, is what allows deeper layers of personality to emerge. There is also another subtle truth here. Open-ended questions communicate emotional safety when they are not loaded with expectation. If a question has a hidden agenda, if it is designed to steer someone toward a specific response, it loses its openness. People feel that energy even if they cannot articulate it. But when your curiosity is clean, when your intention is simply to understand, the interaction becomes lighter and deeper at the same time. There is no pressure in it, only presence, and that is what creates real connection. Not interrogation, not performance, but presence guided by curiosity. So if you want to elevate your communication, stop thinking about what the right question is and start thinking about the quality of attention behind the question. Because people don't just respond to words, they respond to intention. And when your intention is grounded in respect, curiosity, and patience, your questions stop being questions and start becoming invitations into truth. And in the end, that is what intimacy really is. Not finding the perfect answer, but creating the kind of space where truth feels safe enough to appear. If we go one layer deeper into real intimacy, beyond safety and beyond the quality of your questions, we arrive at something most people underestimate completely. Your ability to read what is not being said, because human communication is not primarily verbal. Words are only the surface layer. Beneath that, there is tone, pacing, hesitation, eye contact, posture, breathing patterns, an entire nonverbal language that reveals more truth than language ever could. And if you want to build real connection with someone, you have to learn to listen with your eyes, not just your ears. Most people are trained to focus on content. They hear words and immediately respond to words. But emotionally intelligent communication works differently. It pays attention to alignment or lack of alignment between what is said and what is expressed physically. For example, someone might say, "I'm fine," but their tone is flat, their shoulders are slightly tense, and their gaze avoids engagement. If you are only listening to words, you will miss the truth. But if you are aware, you will recognize that something deeper is happening underneath the surface. And this is where intimacy begins to deepen, not through interrogation, but through perception, because when a person feels that you are actually noticing them, not just hearing them, something shifts inside them. They begin to feel acknowledged in a more complete way, not just as a speaker, but as an emotional being. Now, here is the critical distinction. Reading signals is not about analyzing people like a machine. It is about being present enough to notice emotional shifts in real time. It is about sensitivity, not surveillance. There is a difference between observing with respect and observing with control. One builds trust. The other destroys it, so the goal is not to decode people. It is to attune to them. Attunement means you are emotionally synchronized with the moment. You notice when energy rises, when it drops, when hesitation appears, when comfort expands. And instead of pushing through those signals, you adjust your presence accordingly. If someone becomes quieter, you slow down. If someone becomes more expressive, you allow space for that expression to grow. If you sense discomfort, you don't push forward, you create distance. Not emotional distance, but pressure-free space. This is where most people unintentionally create rejection. Not because of what they say, but because they ignore what the other person is silently communicating. They keep talking when the other person is withdrawing. They keep asking when the other person is retreating. And that misalignment creates emotional friction. But when you are attuned, something very different happens. The interaction begins to feel synchronized, almost effortless. The other person feels like you are with them, not ahead of them, not behind them, but with them. And that feeling is rare, because most people are not experienced in being truly met in conversation. They are used to being responded to, not understood. So when someone actually tracks their emotional state accurately, it creates a sense of relief. They don't have to explain themselves as much. They don't have to perform. They can simply be. And that is where deeper trust begins to form. Now, there is another important layer here. Your nonverbal behavior sets the emotional tone of the entire interaction. Your posture, your eye contact, your pacing. All of it is constantly communicating something. If your energy is rushed, the interaction feels rushed. If your presence is grounded, the interaction becomes grounded. If you are distracted internally, even slightly, the other person will feel that lack of presence. Presence is not just about physical attention. It is emotional availability. It is the ability to stay in the moment without mentally escaping it. And when someone feels that you are fully there with them, without distraction or agenda, it creates a rare psychological experience. They feel prioritized without being pursued. That balance is powerful because pursuit creates pressure, but presence creates comfort, and comfort allows truth to surface. So when you are engaging in conversation, the real skill is not to control the dialogue, but to stay emotionally synchronized with it, to notice shifts, to respect them, and to respond in a way that maintains emotional harmony rather than disruption. Over time, this builds something far more valuable than attraction. It builds trust in your awareness. People begin to feel that you understand them without needing long explanations. And that kind of understanding is deeply attractive in a way that has nothing to do with strategy. It is simply human recognition at a deeper level. And here is the final insight. People rarely remember every word you say, but they always remember how accurately you made them feel seen. Because being seen is not about being observed. It is about being understood without effort. And when you reach that level of awareness in conversation, you stop trying to impress people or manage outcomes. Instead, you start meeting them where they are, moment by moment, with clarity and presence. And in that space, real connection doesn't need to be forced. It naturally reveals itself because the truth is simple. People don't open up to those who speak the most. They open up to those who see the most. If you want to understand where most attempts at intimacy fall apart, it's right here, in the imbalance of the conversation itself. Most people approach connection as if it's something they do to someone. They ask questions, they observe signals, they try to get closeness. But real intimacy doesn't work in one direction. It doesn't flow from one person extracting and the other revealing. It only exists when both people are participating in something shared. That's why the fourth principle is so important. If you want depth, it has to be a two-way experience, because psychologically, human beings are wired for reciprocity. We don't open up deeply to someone who remains emotionally distant. We open up when we sense mutual vulnerability, when the other person is also willing to be seen, not just to see. Now, this doesn't mean oversharing or turning every conversation into emotional exposure. It's not about matching intensity in a forced way. It's about balance. It's about presence that flows in both directions instead of being one-sided. When you only ask and never share, the interaction becomes an evaluation. The other person feels observed, but not met. And over time, that creates distance. Because no one wants to feel like they are being studied without being understood in return. But when you participate, when you appropriately share your thoughts, your perspectives, even your uncertainties. You change the entire emotional structure of the interaction. You move from interrogation into connection, and this is where something very subtle happens. You give the other person permission to do the same, because vulnerability is not just personal, it is relational. When one person shows emotional honesty, it lowers the psychological defenses of the other, not because they are being convinced, but because they are being reassured. It signals, it is safe here to be real. Now here is where many people misunderstand this principle. They think sharing is about impressing or revealing achievements, but that is not what creates intimacy. Intimacy is not built through performance. It is built through authenticity, and authenticity often sounds simple. It sounds like, yeah, I've had moments where I wasn't sure, or I've struggled with that too, or even, I'm still figuring this out. These are not signs of weakness, they are signs of psychological honesty. And honesty is what makes people feel like they are dealing with a real human being, not a curated image, because when someone only presents strength, certainty, and control, the interaction becomes hierarchical. One person appears above the emotional reality of the conversation, while the other remains inside it. And hierarchy kills intimacy. It replaces connection with comparison, but when both people are willing to exist at the same emotional level, neither above nor below something shifts. The interaction becomes equal, and equality is the foundation of trust. Now, there is another layer here that is often missed. Shared conversation creates rhythm. When you alternate between listening and contributing, between asking and revealing, you establish a natural flow. And that flow is what makes conversations feel alive rather than mechanical. You've probably experienced this before. Some conversations feel like interviews, while others feel like movement. In one, you are waiting for your turn. In the other, you are building something together. That difference is not accidental. It is created by whether both people are participating emotionally or only one is carrying the interaction. And here's the deeper truth. People don't remember balanced conversations as exchanges of information. They remember them as experiences, because something is happening between them, not just within them. So when you are engaging with someone, don't position yourself as the questioner alone. Don't position yourself as the observer standing outside their experience. Instead, step into the conversation as a participant in it. Share your perspective when it naturally fits. Offer your reflection when it adds depth. Let them see that you are not just evaluating them. You are present with them. And when that happens, something very important shifts. The other person stops trying to manage how they are being perceived and starts focusing on how they actually feel in your presence. That shift is everything. Because when people stop performing and start feeling, you are no longer dealing with surface-level interaction. You are dealing with something real. And here is what most people never realize. You don't create intimacy by drawing more out of someone else. You create it by entering the space with them. You become part of the experience instead of standing outside of it. That is what makes connection feel mutual instead of transactional. That is what transforms conversation into relationship building instead of information gathering. And ultimately, that is what makes someone feel safe enough to stay. Not because they were questioned well, but because they were met honestly. Because in the end, the deepest connections are not built between one person who reveals and another who listens. They are built between two people who are willing to show up fully and meet each other in the middle of truth. If you really want to understand the point where intimacy either strengthens or completely collapses, it is here in how you respond to boundaries, because boundaries are not rejection. They are not obstacles. They are not emotional barriers designed to push you away. Psychologically, boundaries are communication. They are clarity. They are a person saying, either directly or indirectly, this is where I feel safe and this is where I don't. And most people misunderstand this completely. They hear a boundary and interpret it personally. They think it's about them, but in reality, a boundary is not about your value. It is about the other person's sense of emotional safety in that moment. Now, this is where emotional maturity becomes the defining factor in intimacy. Because when someone says no, or when someone hesitates, or when someone pulls back slightly, there are only two possible directions you can go. You can either respect it fully, or you can try to negotiate it. And that one decision determines whether trust grows or disappears. Respecting boundaries is not passive. It is not weak. In fact, it requires more emotional strength than pushing forward. Because pushing forward is often driven by urgency, insecurity, or desire for control. But respecting a boundary requires something deeper. It requires regulation. It requires presence without entitlement. And entitlement is the silent destroyer of intimacy. The moment you feel that you are owed a response, a yes or continued engagement, you shift the interaction from connection into expectation. And expectation creates pressure, and pressure always leads to withdrawal. But when you respond to boundaries with calm acceptance, something very different happens. You communicate safety at the highest level. You signal, I can handle your truth without trying to change it. And that signal is extremely rare in human interaction. Because most people, when they encounter resistance, immediately try to fix it. They explain more. They push a little harder. They ask again in a slightly different way. Not because they are intentionally manipulative, but because discomfort activates urgency. And urgency destroys sensitivity, but emotional intelligence is not measured by how well you pursue. It is measured by how well you pause, and that pause is where respect lives. When someone sets a boundary and you immediately honor it, you remove tension from the interaction. You make it clear that their autonomy is safe with you. And autonomy is one of the deepest psychological needs in any human relationship. People need to feel that they are choosing freely, not being guided, pressured, or cornered. And here is the paradox. The more fully you accept a boundary, the more trust you build. Because the other person learns that being honest with you does not lead to emotional consequences. It does not lead to guilt, persuasion, or pressure. It leads to respect. That creates psychological safety at a much deeper level than agreement ever could. Now, there is another important layer here. Boundaries are not just about rejection. They are also about pacing. Sometimes a boundary is simply a signal that emotional closeness needs to develop gradually. And if you ignore that pacing, even with good intentions, you disrupt the natural rhythm of trust. Intimacy is not something you accelerate. It is something you allow. Think of it like calibration. Every person has a different emotional speed for trust. Some open quickly, some open slowly. But no matter the speed, forcing acceleration always leads to distortion. You don't get real connection faster, you just get resistance sooner. So respecting boundaries means respecting timing. It means understanding that depth cannot be rushed without losing authenticity. And when you consistently respect someone's boundaries, something very powerful begins to happen. Their defenses lower naturally over time. Not because you pushed through them, but because you never triggered the need to strengthen them in the first place. That is the hidden mechanism most people never notice. People do not open up because they are convinced. They open up because they no longer feel the need to protect themselves. And protection dissolves only in the presence of safety, not pressure. So in your interactions, the real question is not, how do I get closer? The real question is, am I making this person feel safe enough that closeness becomes their choice? Because when closeness is chosen freely, it becomes real. When it is pressured, it becomes fragile. And fragile connection does not last. And this brings us to a deeper truth. Respect is not something you show after intimacy is established. Respect is what creates the conditions for intimacy to exist in the first place. So every time you honor a boundary without resistance, you are doing something far more powerful than avoiding rejection. You are building trust at its foundation, and over time, that consistency becomes your identity in the other person's mind. You become someone who does not force, does not pressure, does not push, but instead understands, accepts, and respects. And that is what makes people feel emotionally safe enough to come closer on their own terms. Because in the end, real connection is never built by crossing boundaries. It is built by proving that you will never need to. If you bring all of this together, emotional safety, the quality of your questions, your ability to read signals, the balance of mutual participation, and your respect for boundaries, you eventually arrive at the deepest principle of all, and it is the one most people struggle with the most: let go of control. Because at the core of most failed attempts at intimacy is not lack of effort, it's the need to control the outcome, the need to be liked, the need for a certain response, the need for certainty about where things are going. And that need, even when subtle, changes the entire emotional tone of an interaction. You can have the right words, the right timing, even the right emotional intelligence, but if your underlying intention is control, people will feel it. Not consciously, not logically, but intuitively. And the moment they feel that you are trying to manage their response, their natural openness begins to shrink. Control is always rooted in fear. Fear of rejection, fear of uncertainty, fear of not being enough, and fear, by its very nature, tightens energy. It makes you predictive, rigid, and internally focused on outcomes instead of presence. But intimacy does not grow in control. It grows in freedom. When you release the need to control how someone feels about you, something very important happens. You stop shaping the interaction and start experiencing it. You become more present, more responsive, and less attached to outcomes that are outside your influence anyway. And paradoxically, this is when you become more influential, not less. Because people are not drawn to those who try to direct them. They are drawn to those who allow them to be themselves. Freedom is attractive because it removes pressure from the psychological system. It allows the other person to relax into their own emotional truth without feeling managed. Now, this does not mean disengagement or indifference. Letting go of control is not the absence of care. It is the absence of attachment to a specific result. You can care deeply about connection while still accepting that you do not dictate how it unfolds. That is emotional maturity. And here is where things become very interesting psychologically. When you stop trying to control how someone perceives you, your authenticity increases naturally. You speak more honestly, you listen more openly, you stop filtering yourself through the lens of will this make them like me, and instead operate from is this real, and realness is felt instantly. Even when it is not articulated, because people are constantly scanning for congruence, the alignment between what is being said and what is being felt. When there is no hidden agenda, no subtle pressure, no emotional manipulation, the interaction becomes clean. And clean interactions feel safe. Now, there is another layer here that is even deeper. Control creates tension not just in the other person, but within yourself. When you are focused on managing outcomes, you are no longer fully present. A part of your attention is always in the future, trying to predict, adjust, and secure what comes next. That internal fragmentation is what people feel as inauthenticity or nervous energy. Even if you appear composed externally, internally you are not fully there. And people sense that absence of presence more than anything else. But when you let go of control, your attention returns to the present moment. You are no longer negotiating the future, you are engaging with what is actually happening. And that shift makes you more grounded, more aware, and more emotionally available. And availability is what creates depth, because real intimacy cannot happen with someone who is partially absent. It requires full presence without agenda. It requires the ability to stay with the moment without trying to steer it somewhere else. And here is the paradox that most people never realize. The less you try to control connection, the more stable it becomes. Because what is built without pressure is built on truth, not compliance. So instead of asking, how do I make this go a certain way? The deeper question becomes, can I stay fully present no matter how this unfolds? That is where confidence is born, not from certainty about outcomes, but from stability within uncertainty. And when you operate from that state, something very powerful happens in how others experience you. You stop feeling like someone who is trying to get something from them, and you start feeling like someone who is simply there with them. Not pulling, not pushing, just present, and that presence is rare. Because most people are unconsciously trying to manage how they are perceived. But when you are not doing that, you become emotionally transparent in the best possible way. There is nothing hidden, nothing forced, nothing rehearsed, and in that space, people feel something they don't often feel in modern interaction: ease. Ease is what makes people stay. Ease is what allows conversations to deepen naturally. Ease is what makes us sound comfortable instead of awkward. And ease is what turns interaction into connection. So the ultimate shift is this. You stop trying to engineer intimacy, and you start allowing it to emerge. You stop managing perception, and you start living your truth in real time. And when you reach that point, you realize something profound. Connection was never something you had to control into existence. It was something that appeared the moment you stopped interfering with it. Because in the end, the strongest relationships are not built through control. They are built through the courage to let go of it and trust what remains when nothing is being forced.